On January 15, 1919, a wave 25 feet tall tore through one of the most crowded neighborhoods in America at 35 miles an hour, and it was not made of water. It was molasses, 2.3 million gallons of it, dark and sweet and heavier than the sea, and by the time it stopped moving, 21 people were dead. This is not a legend. The disaster has a plaque, a court file running to tens of thousands of pages, and survivors who spent the rest of their lives trying to describe the sound it made. And yet the Great Boston Molasses Flood is still told mostly as a punchline right up until you learn what it actually did to the people standing in its path. Start with the place. Boston's North End in 1919 was one of the densest immigrant neighborhoods in the country. Narrow streets, brick tenements, laundry strung between windows, the smell of the harbor and horse stables and bakeries all tangled together. Most residents were Italian immigrants, many spoke little English and held almost no political power, which is going to matter later in this story. Along Commercial Street, at the edge of the water, ran the elevated railway, a steel trestle carrying trains above the traffic, and beside it stood freight sheds, a city stable, a firehouse, and paving yards where laborers ate lunch outdoors even in January. And looming over all of it was the tank. 50 feet tall. 90 feet across. A riveted steel cylinder painted brown, built to hold 2.3 million gallons of molasses. Why did Boston have a giant tank of molasses? Because molasses wasn't just for baking. Fermented and distilled, it becomes industrial alcohol, and industrial alcohol was a key ingredient in smokeless powder and high explosives. When the First World War broke out, demand exploded, and in 1915 the Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of United States Industrial Alcohol, USIA, rushed a massive storage tank onto the Boston waterfront to catch shipments coming up from the Caribbean. And rushed is exactly the right word. The man who oversaw construction, Arthur Gell, was a treasurer, a finance man. He had no engineering training. He couldn't read a blueprint. According to the evidence that came out later in court, no engineer or architect ever reviewed the plans. The standard safety test for a tank like this was to fill it with water and watch for failures. Gell filled it with 6 inches of water, declared it sound, and started pumping in molasses within days, because a shipment was already steaming toward the harbor. The tank leaked from the very beginning. It leaked so visibly that neighborhood residents brought cups and pails and scraped molasses off its sides to take home. Flakes of steel came off inside it. An employee named Isaac Gonzalez was so alarmed by the groaning sounds it made that, again, according to later testimony, he ran to the waterfront at night to check on it, convinced it was going to fail. And when workers reported the leaks, the company's response was not to reinforce the tank. It was to paint it brown, so the leaks would be harder to see. Now come to January 1919. The war had ended 2 months earlier, but the tank was busier than ever. On January 12th and 13th, a tanker arrived from Puerto Rico and topped the tank up with a fresh load of warm molasses, bringing it to nearly full capacity, around 2.3 million gallons, roughly 26 million pounds. The warm cargo settled on top of the colder molasses already inside, and it may have begun fermenting, building gas pressure. That's one contributing factor engineers still debate. What we know for certain is the weather. Boston had been brutally cold, close to zero, and on January 15 the temperature climbed above 40 degrees. A strange, mild, almost spring-like day. People were outside. Workers sat in the sun eating lunch. Kids cut through the yards by the tank on their way from school. At around 12:30, the tank spoke. Witnesses described a low rumble, a shudder in the ground, and then a sound like a machine gun, hundreds of rivets shearing off, one after another, faster and faster. And then the wall of a 2-story sea let go all at once. Try to picture what 2.3 million gallons does when the steel holding it simply disappears. The initial wave was estimated at 25 feet high, moving at roughly 35 miles per hour, faster than anyone can run, faster than a horse can bolt from a standstill. Molasses is denser than water, so the wave didn't splash. It hit like a moving wall. Sections of the tank sheared outward like shrapnel, one slab of steel sliced through the columns of the elevated railway, and the trestle buckled and sagged. An oncoming train stopped just short of the collapsed section. The motorman saw the track drop away in front of him and hauled the brake in time. The wave flattened the freight sheds. It knocked the Engine 31 firehouse clean off its foundation and shoved the whole building, firefighters still inside, toward the harbor. A firefighter named George Lay was pinned beneath the wreckage, held down as the molasses slowly rose around him, while his colleagues spent hours cutting through timbers trying to reach him. They couldn't get there in time. A few blocks of ordinary life simply vanished. Bridget Clougherty, a woman in her 60s, was crushed when the wave lifted her house off its foundation and smashed it against the elevated railway. Her son Martin was carried out of his own bed. He woke up already inside the wave, swimming in darkness, and survived. He managed to pull his sister out of the wreckage. Down near the tank, 10-year-old Pasquale Iantasca and 10-year-old Maria Di Stasio had been collecting firewood by the freight cars. Both were killed. Maria's brother Antonio was swept up, battered, and knocked unconscious. He woke in a hospital bed, one of the luckiest people in Boston that day. And then there were the horses. The city stable stood directly in the flood's path, and dozens of horses were caught in the spreading tide, stuck, as one report put it, like flies on flypaper. Police officers waded in and shot them where they lay, because there was no other mercy left to offer. Here's the detail that makes this disaster uniquely cruel: molasses changes as it cools. When the wave first burst out, warm and churning, it flowed fast. But spread thin across a freezing city block, it began to stiffen, and everyone caught in it was caught in something slowly turning to glue. Rescuers described wading through knee-deep syrup that gripped their boots and would not let go. They fought to pull victims free and felt the molasses fighting back, sucking people down, sealing over mouths and noses. Some of the dead were not killed by the wave itself. They suffocated by inches while rescuers strained a few feet away. Help arrived fast, and from an unexpected direction. The USS Nantucket, a training ship, was docked nearby, and more than 100 cadets sprinted into the flood zone within minutes, wading in waist-deep to haul people out. Police, firemen, and Red Cross workers followed. Nurses knelt in the muck. The Haymarket Relief Station was overwhelmed, its floors coated brown within hours, doctors cutting molasses-stiffened clothing off patients with shears. The rescue went on for days, and the search for the dead went on far longer. The last victims weren't recovered for months. One was finally found in the water beneath a wharf, so glazed and preserved by the molasses that he could only be identified by his effects. In the end, the toll stood at 21 dead and around 150 injured: laborers, teamsters, firemen, a homemaker, 2 10-year-olds. An entire cross-section of a working neighborhood. The cleanup became a legend of its own. Fresh water did almost nothing. Firefighters discovered that salt water cut the syrup, so fireboats pumped the harbor onto the streets for weeks while workers spread sand to blot up the rest. The harbor ran brown well into spring, some accounts say into summer. And the stickiness traveled. Rescue crews, spectators, and cleanup gangs tracked molasses across the entire city, onto trolley seats, telephone handles, staircase railings, until, as Bostonians grimly joked, everything you touched in town was sweet. Now comes the part of the story that feels the most modern. Within days, United States Industrial Alcohol offered its explanation: sabotage. Anarchists, the company said, had bombed the tank. And you have to understand, in 1919, that wasn't an absurd claim. This was the edge of the Red Scare. Italian anarchist cells really were setting bombs in Boston and across America, and the tank itself had reportedly received threats. Blaming a bomb was convenient, plausible, and it pointed the finger directly at the immigrant neighborhood the flood had just destroyed. The victims sued anyway. More than 100 claims were consolidated into one of the largest civil actions Massachusetts had ever seen. The court appointed an auditor, Colonel Hugh Ogden, to hear the evidence, and the hearings ground on for years, with hundreds of witnesses and tens of thousands of pages of testimony. USIA brought experts who swore only dynamite could have burst the tank. The plaintiffs brought engineers who calculated that the steel was simply, catastrophically inadequate. In 1925, Ogden ruled. There was no bomb. The tank had been too weak from the day it was built, walls too thin, safety margins ignored, warnings dismissed. A disaster, in effect, with a construction date. USIA paid out around $628,000 in damages, millions in today's money, and modern engineering analysis has only confirmed the verdict. A 21st century review concluded the tank's walls were roughly half as thick as even the standards of 1915 demanded, and that the steel itself was brittle, low in manganese, the same kind of flawed steel, as it happens, that went into the Titanic. The flood changed the rules. In its aftermath, Boston, and then Massachusetts, and eventually jurisdictions across the country, began requiring that construction plans be signed and sealed by licensed engineers before a permit could be issued. Lawyers still cite the case as an early landmark of corporate accountability. A company tried to blame terrorists, and a court followed the rivets instead. Two strange footnotes before we finish. First, the day after the flood, January 16, 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified. Prohibition. Some writers have suggested USIA was racing to fill the tank and cash in on drinkable alcohol before the ban arrived. It's a tidy theory, but the evidence is thin, and the tank's business was industrial alcohol, so treat that one as speculation rather than fact. And second, the smell. For decades afterward, North End residents swore that on hot summer days the neighborhood still smelled faintly of molasses, sweet and dark, rising out of the cobblestones. Is that chemistry, or folklore? Honestly, probably a little of both. Nobody ever measured it. But people who lived there kept insisting on it into the second half of the century, and that persistence tells you how deep the day sank into the city's memory. Today, the site is a small waterfront park with bocce courts and a modest plaque that most tourists walk past without reading. 21 lives, a wall of sugar, a corporate cover story, and a court ruling that helped build modern engineering law, condensed onto a sign the size of a cutting board. The Boston Molasses Flood sounds like a joke. It was actually a warning about what happens when speed beats safety, when a finance man overrules physics, and when a company's first instinct after a catastrophe is to find someone else to blame. The molasses is long gone. The lesson, hopefully, isn't. If you want more forgotten history that sounds made up but isn't, subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.